All right, it is 4 p.m. Thank you once again for joining us. We appreciate your presence today. Today's webinar is Bridging Borders Through Language Museums, Promoting Language Awareness. Well, language museums play an important role in curating and promoting language awareness around multilingualism and multiliteracies, Indigenous languages, and the rich sociocultural and racial diversity of linguistic landscapes. They tell stories of languages lost or historically ignored because of the marginalized status of their speakers. They can also illuminate the central function of language in all facets of public lives. Though they operate outside or alongside traditional sites of language education, language museums can inspire teachers, inform policymakers, and help mobilize public support for programs that enhance language competencies in schools and broader society. The invited speakers for this CAL webinar will speak to such possibilities, drawing on their insights and experiences from establishing and directing language museums, respectively, Planet World in Washington, D.C., and the Canadian Language Museum in Toronto, Canada. Once again, hello and welcome to you all. Thank you for joining the Center for Applied Linguistics today for this 30-minute webinar in our Critical Conversations, Research to Policy and Practice series. This year, our theme is Multilingualism Without Borders. For 2023, we'll be looking at spaces where multilingualism is practiced across, through, and around all kinds of borders and barriers. Today's webinar is entitled Bridging Borders Through Language Museums, Promoting Language Awareness. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto cal.org after this event concludes. Also, there is closed captioning available for this website. Press the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen to turn on. The Center for Applied Linguistics is providing this event as a public service. However, the views, thoughts, and opinions expressed belong solely to the persons expressing them and do not necessarily represent the views of the Center for Applied Linguistics. We are joined by esteemed experts in their fields who work at the intersection of research, policy, and practice in language education, language access, and equity. We are very lucky to have so much knowledge on one call, and we encourage you, the audience, to ask questions via the Q&A box below. We will address as many questions as we can at the end of our discussion today. Also, you may click on the chat button at the bottom of your screen. I apologize, that may not be turned on at the moment. I will fix that shortly. Please try it once it's turned on and tell us where you're joining us from. Finally, before we begin, please be sure to mute your microphones now to avoid any interruptions during this presentation. Today, we have Dr. Elaine Gold and Ann B. Friedman with us, who will share their research and perspectives on questions around how language museums can fill a space in our discussion of our multilingual societies that other programs and initiatives may be less equipped to reach. Dr. Gold initiated the founding of the Canadian Language Museum in 2011 and oversees its operations. She brings to her work at the museum a PhD in linguistics, an MA in art history, and strong experience in arts administration and curatorial work. Dr. Gold taught linguistics at the University of Toronto for over 20 years. She has lived in Central, Western, and Northern Canada, and is dedicated to promoting and protecting this country's rich language heritage. She is a recipient of the 2019 National Achievement Award from the Canadian Linguistics Association and received a Queen Elizabeth II Platinum Jubilee Award in 2023 for her promotion of multilingualism, including raising awareness of Indigenous languages through the Canadian Language Museum. Ann B. Friedman is the founder and CEO of Planet World and the developer behind the restoration of the Franklin School, the museum's home. She was a beginning reading and writing teacher in Montgomery County, Maryland for 9 years until her retirement in 2011. From 2010 to 2016, she served as the chair of the board of the Seed Foundation, the parent body of the only U.S. public inner city college prep boarding schools, where she remains a board member. Ms. Friedman is a director of the American Alliance of Museums and serves on the board of the Aspen Music Festival and School and the National Symphony Orchestra. She is a graduate of the Stanford University and earned master's degree from the London School of Economics and American University. She is married to New York Times Foreign Affairs columnist Thomas L. Friedman. Once again, thank you for joining us today to talk about this important topic. Okay, we only have 30 minutes, so let's get started. I'm going to hand it over to one of our co-facilitators, Melissa Cheston.
Hello, everyone. To provide some context to those joining the webinar today, I would like to start with some introductions from our participants beyond what we just heard. Anne, would you start us off and give us a brief introduction to Planet Word, and then would love to hear about how your background has shaped the priorities and scope of work at the museum.
Sure. So unlike Elaine with her amazing background and achievements in linguistics, I am coming to the museum world from being a reading teacher. And I had the idea for Planet Word to solve a problem, an American problem. And that was the declining literacy test scores, every measure of literacy in the United States was declining. The number of adults who read a book for pleasure during the year, the number of magazines and newspapers declining all the time. And why I thought this was so important to reverse or attempt to reverse was that I think that a literate society is the foundation of a strong democracy. And we know that because we've had surveys done that show that readers are more likely to be volunteers, to be active in their communities, to vote. We see that the population in our prisons is disproportionately people who are functionally illiterate. We know that people who read are more likely to graduate from high school, to have more success and career happiness. And also reading allows you to gain empathy and tolerance, which is so important in a country and a world where it's increasingly multicultural and we live so close to each other. So I thought that reading is something that we needed to promote and advance, but how to do that? And, what were some new ways that hadn't been tried? Because obviously schools and traditional ways of advancing literacy weren't working. So this was in about 2012. I read about a new museum of mathematics in New York City, MoMath. And there, without having a collection, without artifacts, they were bringing the abstract concepts of math to life in a museum setting, using technology and hands-on interactives. And I thought, there's the idea. Why don't I try a museum that could bring words and language to life and create a buzz around reading and a buzz around words? And so there began my many years long efforts at starting Planet Word. We opened in the middle of the pandemic in October of 2020, but we were ready. We had designed all the galleries, and by that time, things had changed. In America, the focus had shifted to really a national political focus spotlight on words and language like never before. So it wasn't just in schools and people learning how to read that was important and newsworthy, but it was also, understanding what does it mean? Are there alternative facts? Is there fake news? All of these issues came to the fore while we were planning for Planet Word. So all of a sudden, the relevance of the museum and a place where you could discuss these issues tied to literacy, tied to language, became more and more important. And so that's what we've got. Our museum has galleries on songwriting, oratory, humor writing, literacy, poetry, advertising, copywriting, but it also has interactives where you can dive deeper into subjects from sociolinguistics like forensic linguistics, bias, dialect, truth in advertising, misinformation, disinformation. So we've really broadened our scope to tackle all these word-related issues.
Wow. I
Wow,
also have not been, and now I kind of would like to go immediately, even more
Please do.
than
Yeah,
what I had
that's-
heard.
That's a
And
really
it's a free
interesting
museum.
collection. Wow. So the Canadian Language Museum is different in its scope, and it'd be Elaine, I'd love to hear about some information and background about it, and how your own work and scholarly background have shaped the interests and the kinds of projects that take place at the Canadian Language Museum.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. And although the museum is very different from Anne's, we certainly have a lot of things in common in terms of our goals and how we started it. So I was, as you mentioned in the introduction, I was teaching at the University of Toronto, and I taught courses frequently on English in Canada, and I developed courses about the different languages of Canada. So I was already thinking about the issues of the 2 official languages in Canada, the many Indigenous languages in Canada, all the languages brought by more recent immigrants. I'd already been thinking about those issues and how to share them with my students. My aha moment for me was an announcement in 2007 on Linguist List, and it was actually from Denmark, that said that they were planning a language museum, and I had never heard of such a thing. And I thought, language museum, if any country should have a language museum, Canada should have a language museum, because really our whole history, our constitution, our ongoing political debates, so many of them revolve around language and revolve around language rights. And so we have this long history with our 2 official languages of English and French. But of course, we have more than 65 Indigenous languages, and many of them unique to Canada, and most all of them at risk in some sense, very much because of government policies, particularly residential schools. And on top of that, Canada is very multicultural and has had government policies supporting multiculturalism for almost 50 years. So in the past, there was this image of a mosaic of cultures. So there was already, I would say, a broad popular interest or support for a variety of languages. It wasn't that I had to make an argument that languages are important, but I thought it was really important to bring this information to a wider audience and to the general public, in the same way that Anne felt this very important to share this information with the wider public. So for a few years, I did research about language museums, and in 2011, founded the museum with a group of linguists. But of course, we started with no money and no building. and decided that we would create thriving exhibits, but we wanted real exhibits, not just a web presence. And so every year since 2011, we have been creating a new traveling exhibit, so that we have exhibits about Canadian English and Canadian French and the Inuit language and the Cree language, sign languages of Canada. So we have quite a variety of exhibits. And we've really been able to reach a very broad cross-section of the Canadian public because our exhibits are small and they tour easily to places like libraries, community centers, public schools, high schools, and we're able to reach people who might not normally go to a museum. And so even though we were very small and we didn't have an exhibit space, we were still able to reach the public. For the past 7 years, we were given a very beautiful space on the Glendon campus of York University in Toronto. So now we do have an exhibit space, but we also continue with our traveling exhibits.
Yeah, that's so interesting about the relative low-tech background of the Canadian Language Museum, and then in a way encouraging the kind of travel to sites and to audiences that otherwise would not have a chance to learn about the work. So that's really interesting. Thanks.
I know we've already touched a bit on this, but I would like to dig into this a little bit more. It seems language museums or museums related to language and its use, particularly in the case of Play That Word, seem to function as a space or institution adjacent to these traditional spaces of both education or policy making, and they do bring people together, but I would say with a posture of learning and wanting to engage, which isn't something we see necessarily in all venues. So wanted to ask about that advocacy angle. For Anne, what areas of advocacy or impact do you have in view for Planet Word, whether these are dreams and hopes or what you're already seeing towards your goals?
So we, by law, are, as a nonprofit organization, are not allowed to really be true advocates. We can't lobby for anything, but we see ourselves as a convener. Museums are among the most trusted institutions in public life. All sorts of surveys show that. And so we are trying to build on that trust that people have in museums, that we are legitimate, fair, based on truth and facts. And so we have decided, for instance, that there's a debate going on right now in America about the science of reading, how to teach beginning reading. And so we're not taking a particular stance on that, which is because it's very controversial. It's, phonics or whole language for those of you listening who know about reading instruction. We are convening different experts in the field. They can come to us in person in our auditorium or do virtual programs where we have a reach across the United States and talk about different aspects of this subject. We also are tackling misinformation and disinformation, and someone in the chats asked, what's the difference? Well, misinformation can just be passing along incorrect information purely out of ignorance or by mistake, whereas disinformation is a determined effort to convey and purvey incorrect information, usually to sway things in politics. And that is a real threat to democracy. If we can't trust what we hear in the media or what we read, if there is no sort of trust in facts as reported, we cannot sustain our democracy. how can you vote and make decisions unless you can trust the information that you're reading that shapes your voting decisions? And so that's very important to us. And we have someone coming to a special dinner in June who's in the State Department leading a fight against mis and disinformation overseas. So we are doing all sorts of different programs to pursue this. And then we think we need to be talking about artificial intelligence. That's sort of, when you think about it, it's almost the farthest extension of language use that we have today, because chat GPTs, they're built on how language works. So it's the ultimate extension in language, I think, in artificial intelligence and how we use it today. And so we are also convening speakers on artificial intelligence and trustworthy AI. So that's the kind, it's not advocacy, but it's, we will tell you what we think are important topics about words and language that we should all be talking about. And also discussions about endangered languages. And we have smaller exhibits that dive deep into subjects like that and talk about how languages become endangered and what different peoples are doing to prevent that or to revitalize their own language.
Yeah, something that stands out so much from that description is just the massive amount of breadth in what you are able to touch on or convene, and how so many different individuals or stakeholders, general interested parties, could find something of,
You got it.
value that Planet Word can speak to in a way that they might not be able to find somewhere else, but then their neighbor might also be interested in something else that you can
Right.
speak
And
to.
they can sing in our songwriting gallery, which is karaoke lounge style. And that's their connection to words and language. We are happy for them to do that.
Yes, and of all ages, you have the young ones learning to read, the techie adults fascinated by AI, and we can all come away learning something. Yeah, wonderful.
Let me take up the advocacy theme also with Anne. I mean, there's so many interesting, with Elaine, Anne raised so many interesting things about the museum, maybe a soft advocacy is the way I might describe it, of engaging citizens and voters. One of the interesting things I was just struck me about, because Elaine mentioned earlier the important work of Indigenous documentation, revitalization, and presenting this work in the museum. Elaine, I'm curious about also, to expand on that work, but also any issues in the politics of that documentation and the consulting of stakeholders from Indigenous communities, because I know that in Canada, that is a huge political issue right now across many disciplines.
Okay, this is a very broad question, but I want to start with talking about the type of advocacy, because we're often asked about this in terms of the advocacy in particular for Indigenous languages. And we do have a special commitment to Indigenous languages, but of course, as Anne mentioned, we can't directly lobby for certain political outcomes. But I think a very big role for the museum is creating what we call allies. It's creating allies for the Indigenous languages in educating the broad public. So first of all, because of the museum was created during the time that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was sort of collecting its materials, but since they have published their findings, there is a lot of interest across the country in Indigenous languages and a much higher awareness of the fact that they have been endangered because of colonial practices. But on the other hand, there is a huge amount of ignorance about the languages. So I have people coming in who have no idea there's even more than one Indigenous language in Canada, or more than one language family. And so I think a big role, of course, is education, because I think for people, we want to get people on side to understand that's important to maintain these languages, and for the government to provide support and education in these languages. We have to get the general public to understand that and be aware of that too. So it's not lobbying directly, but it's raising awareness of the importance of maintaining Indigenous languages and how central they are to Indigenous culture. So that's one important thing we do. I'll come back to your question. I am coming back. And the other thing is that there is a lot of shame, it's sometimes I've heard it described as, from Indigenous people about using their own languages because of the amount of racism in the past, so that people aren't even comfortable using their languages. And I think that creating these exhibits and having an exhibit come into your community that's about your language helps to raise pride and helps children see that these are valuable languages. Look, there's an exhibit about it. They're important. They have dialects across the country. These are important to learn. So I like to think that we are, in a way, promoting these languages both within the Indigenous community and in the broader community. The issue you raise about how do you go about that in these difficult political times, because of course, I'm, obviously a non-Indigenous white person, so I can't just create something and send it in. Like, here is my creation of an Indigenous language. I have to work very carefully with Indigenous communities in creating these exhibits. And so we always do that. I'm always working with Indigenous consultants when we create these exhibits. And going forward, we're talking about other ways of creating partnerships and having even more involvement and interaction when the exhibits go into Indigenous communities. But believe me, this is a big learning process and a continuous learning process. Our board is very heavily weighted. Majority of members of my board of directors are Indigenous, or work directly with Indigenous languages. So I have wonderful people to consult and guide in terms of those rather tricky relationships right now, because, we want to be allies. I want to be an ally, and I don't want to project my views on top of an Indigenous community's views of what's the best way to represent their language.
Thank you. I wish we had a lot more time.
No.
It's been so interesting. Althea, I think we probably have time for some questions from the audience. What do you think?
Yes, I think we have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions very quickly, because we're short on time. There are so many questions today, very interesting, actually. A lot of people are interested in this topic. Ima Khan, I apologize if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, does the language museum focus only on the historical linguistics or the current trends as well? If the current trends as well, how does the word museum correlate? He says, thank you. Also, we would love to develop one in Pakistan with what would be the best steps and aspects of it, which is kind of a lot.
I can address that issue. When we create an exhibit, so for example, our most recent exhibit is about Chinese languages in Canada. Our exhibits are not, it definitely shows the history, because I think people are very interested in this particular topic, in looking at the history of Chinese languages in Canada and how they've changed. Cantonese used to be the predominant language spoken in Canada. Now it's Mandarin. It's very interesting to see how immigration patterns over the years have changed, which languages have been brought where have they come from? Not only from China, but from Chinese speakers in India, from obviously from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, from Indonesia. So there is a history, I wouldn't call it necessarily a history of linguistics, but we always try in every exhibit to also look to the future and talk about how are these languages being maintained in Canada right now, what media are there, you know, schools, TV, what is supporting the use of these languages in Canada. So my quick answer is that our exhibits try to look at the past, but really, we're really interested in how they're continuing on into the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was very in-depth. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. I thank you so much. I would really like to thank our wonderful guest speakers today, Dr. Elaine Gold and Anne Friedman, for sharing their insight and experience. Finally, I would like to thank you, our audience, for your questions and comments and enthusiasm around this important issue. We do encourage you to share what you've learned today with your colleagues. And to that end, we will be sending a recording of this webinar to you via email. You can find this event and many more resources that support multilingual learners on our website, www.cal.org. Please also take a moment to fill out a brief survey about how we did today. I will be dropping that in the chat. And once again, we thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Althea.
Yes, thank you.